At dawn, the people of Troy found an enormous wooden horse standing on the empty beach. The Greek ships were gone. After 10 years of war, the Trojans believed the horse was a gift from the gods. They believed they had survived. They believed they had won. They were wrong. This is the story of the Trojan Horse, one of the most famous acts of deception in all of human history. It is a story about a war that lasted a decade, about the desperation of men who had forgotten what home felt like, and about the fatal moment when an entire civilization chose to believe what it wanted to believe, rather than what was true. Welcome to English Through Great Stories. I am your narrator, and this is The Fall of Troy. Chapter 1: 10 Years of Fire. To understand the wooden horse, you must first understand the war that created it. And to understand the war, you must begin with a woman, a prince, and a broken promise. Her name was Helen. She was the wife of Menelaus, the king of Sparta. The ancient poets called her the most beautiful woman in the world. And whether that is legend or truth, what matters is this: a Trojan prince named Paris took her to Troy. Whether she went willingly or was taken by force, the ancient sources disagree, but the result was the same. Menelaus, burning with fury, called upon every king in Greece to honor the old oath they had sworn, that every man who had competed for Helen's hand had pledged to defend whoever won her. Now Menelaus called that pledge into being. The response was enormous. Ships gathered from every corner of the Greek world. 1,000 ships, the poets said. Perhaps an exaggeration, but the fleet that assembled at Aulis was without question a fleet of legendary size. Leading it was Agamemnon, High King of Mycenae, brother of the wronged Menelaus. He was a powerful man and a proud one. Pride would become a theme of this war. For both sides. The Greeks crossed the sea and landed on the shores of Troy. They expected a swift victory. Surely 1,000 ships and the greatest heroes alive could bring the city down quickly. Perhaps in a season, certainly not in 10 years. But Troy held. The walls of Troy were legendary, massive and pale in the Aegean sun. The myths said that Apollo and Poseidon themselves had built Troy's walls, and for 10 years no Greek attack could break them. No battering ram could bring them down. No ladder was tall enough. The Greeks could not go through the walls, and they could not go over them. And so they camped on the beach and waited, year after year after year. Think about what 10 years of war does to men. The greatest warriors on both sides fought with extraordinary courage, and great men died. Achilles, the mightiest of the Greeks, fell before the gates of the city he had nearly conquered alone, and still Troy stood. By the 10th year, the Greek camp was a place of exhaustion. The men had aged. Boys who had sailed from home as teenagers were now hollow-eyed veterans. They spoke less of glory and more of their wives, their children, their fields. The war had become a way of life, and that is perhaps the most dangerous thing a war can become. Chapter 2: The Mind of Odysseus. Among all the kings and heroes assembled on that beach, one man was different. Not the tallest, not the strongest, not the most beautiful. He was compact and quick-eyed. While other heroes trusted strength, Odysseus watched, calculated, and waited. His name was Odysseus, king of the small island of Ithaca, and his weapon was not a spear, it was his mind. Odysseus had long seen what most refused to admit, that the war could not be won by force alone. Troy would not fall to a frontal assault. It had already survived 10 years of the greatest warriors alive. The walls were too strong, the Trojans too determined. Something else was needed. Something the Greeks had never tried in all their years on that burning, blood-soaked plain. Something that required not strength, but cunning. A trick, the oldest weapon of a desperate man. Whether from divine inspiration or pure human ingenuity, the plan was breathtaking in its daring. The Greeks would not attack the walls. They would not besiege the gates. They would instead offer Troy a gift so large, so unusual, so apparently sacred, that the Trojans would open their own gates and carry it inside themselves. The gift would be a horse, an enormous wooden horse, hollow inside, large enough to conceal a select group of warriors in its belly. The Greek fleet would appear to sail away in defeat. A single Greek soldier would be left behind to convince the Trojans that the horse was a sacred offering to the goddess Athena, and that bringing it inside their walls would guarantee divine protection for their city. It was, in every sense, a beautiful lie. When Odysseus presented the plan in the Greek council, there was silence. Some men objected. It was dishonorable, they said. It was not the way of heroes. But Agamemnon listened, and the weight of 10 years pressed upon his shoulders like stone. They had tried honor. They had tried courage. They had tried the sword and the spear for a decade, and Troy still stood. It was time to try something else. The plan was approved. Chapter 3. The Horse of Wood and Shadow. The man chosen to build the horse was a craftsman named Epeius. He was not a famous warrior. His fame was of a quieter, more lasting kind. He was a master carpenter, a builder of extraordinary skill, and he had the tools and the knowledge to construct something that had never been built before. Epeius is one of the lesser-known figures of this story, but without him there would be no story at all. The timber came from the forests near the coast, fir trees, strong and straight, felled and dragged down to the beach by teams of men. Epeius worked with focused intensity, measuring, cutting, shaping. The ribs of the horse went up first, like the curved bones of a great sea creature. Then the sides, planked and fitted together with such precision that the interior was sealed tight and dark, like the hold of a ship, like a tomb. The head was carved with care, a long neck arched proudly, the nostrils flared as if catching a sea breeze, the eyes inlaid and gleaming. The legs were solid columns of wood, planted wide to support the weight of what would be hidden inside. A trap-door was built into the belly, invisible from the outside unless you knew exactly where to look. It could be opened from within. From outside, the horse looked magnificent, almost alive, almost divine. When it was finished, the Greeks stood before it in the flickering torchlight and understood for the first time what Odysseus had imagined. It was enormous, tall as a small building, wide as a merchant's wagon. It was beautiful, it was strange, and it was hollow, waiting to be filled with the men who would end the war that 10 years of fighting could not. An inscription was carved into its flank, a dedication to the goddess Athena. A lie written in wood. The men who would climb inside were chosen with care, not the largest, but the quietest, men who could remain still in darkness for hours without losing their nerve. Odysseus himself would lead them. Others included Menelaus, Diomedes, Neoptolemus, the young son of Achilles, and a handful of the most trusted and battle-hardened soldiers in the Greek army. They climbed inside one by one, crouching in the darkness, breathing slowly, and waited for the world to change around them. Chapter 4. The Empty Shore. Before dawn on the appointed day, the Greek camp on the beach disappeared. Tents were struck, equipment was loaded, fire pits were extinguished, 10 years of habitation cleared away in the grey hours before sunrise as if it had never been. The great fleet launched into the dark water and sailed away, not toward Greece, but around a nearby headland, the island of Tenedos, just out of sight of the Trojan lookouts, watching and waiting. One man was left behind. His name was Sinon, and he had volunteered for one of the most dangerous roles in the entire plan. He was to be found by the Trojans, alone, apparently abandoned, frightened. His story had been prepared with great care. He would tell the Trojans that the Greeks had sailed home in defeat, that the horse was a sacred offering to appease Athena for the theft of her sacred statue from Troy, and that Sinon himself had fled execution. He was, in other words, a professional liar, calm enough to weep convincingly, clever enough to answer every difficult question without hesitation, brave enough to stand alone in enemy territory with nothing but a false story and his own nerve to protect him. It is worth pausing here to appreciate the sheer daring of this. An entire war, 10 years and countless deaths would now rest on one man's ability to cry in front of strangers and make them believe him. When dawn broke, the Trojan lookouts on the walls rubbed their eyes. The beach was empty. The fires were cold. The ships, 1,000 ships, 10 years of ships, were gone. There was nothing left but flat sand, a few abandoned posts, the remnants of a camp. And in the middle of the empty beach, enormous and still in the morning light, the wooden horse. For a long moment no one spoke. Then the gates of Troy opened and the people poured out. Chapter 5. The Debate at the Gates. They came out slowly at first, soldiers, then citizens, then women and children who had not breathed open air freely in 10 years without the shadow of Greek ships on the horizon. They walked across the plain that had been soaked with so much blood, and they looked at the empty Greek camp in something that was not yet quite joy, but was moving rapidly toward it. Relief, disbelief, the raw, trembling feeling of a threat that has passed. And then they reached the horse. It was even larger up close. They walked around it, reaching out to touch the smooth wooden flanks, tilting their heads back to look up at the carved head with its gleaming eyes. Some people laughed in nervous wonder. Others were uneasy in a way they could not name. There was a feeling about the horse, a strange presence, a silence that seemed too heavy, like the quiet of a room where someone is hiding just behind the door. Then Sinon was found, crouching in the marsh grass near the shore, dirty and shaking. The Trojans seized him and brought him before King Priam, and Sinon wept and spoke and lied with the precision of a man who had rehearsed every word. He told them of the Greeks' departure, of the sacred offering to Athena, of his own supposed escape from execution. He told them that the horse had been made large on purpose, so the Trojans could not bring it through their gates and claim the goddess's protection for themselves. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. The story was just convincing enough, just complicated enough, just self-consistent enough to pass. And the Trojans, who had been under siege for 10 years, who desperately wanted this war to be over, who wanted to believe the gods had finally favored them, they listened. But not everyone was persuaded. Troy had its warning voices. Troy had those who saw clearly what others refused to see. The tragedy is that no one listened to them. The first was Cassandra. She was a princess of Troy, one of Priam's daughters, and she bore a curse that has become one of the most haunting images in all of Greek mythology. Apollo had granted her the gift of true prophecy, but when she refused his love, he had added a terrible condition. She would always tell the truth about the future, and no one would ever believe her. She came forward and told them plainly the horse was a trick. Inside it were Greek soldiers. If it entered the city, Troy would burn. The Trojans heard her and turned away. They had heard Cassandra before. She always prophesied disaster. She was considered unbalanced, unfortunate, the kind of person whose words, however sincere, carried the taint of obsession. They pitied her and did not listen. Inside the belly of the horse, in the total darkness, the Greek soldiers lay absolutely still. They heard the murmur of Trojan voices outside. They heard the laughter and the footsteps. They breathed slowly through their mouths and did not make a sound. Chapter 6. The Sign of the Serpents. The second warning voice was louder, and its refusal cost its owner everything. His name was Laocoon. He was a priest of Poseidon, and he had the kind of courage that comes from genuine conviction. Not performance, not politics, but the honest, uncomfortable certainty that something is terribly wrong. He stood before the horse with his 2 sons beside him, and he threw a spear at it. The spear struck the hollow side with a deep, resonant boom, like a drum, like an empty room. "Do not trust the horse, Trojans," he cried out. "Whatever it is, I fear the Greeks, even bearing gifts." These words, or something very close to them, have echoed down 3,000 years. They're among the most quoted lines in all classical literature. The phrase, "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts," lives in our language to this day. Laocoon was right. He was completely and absolutely right. And what happened next is one of the most disturbing scenes in the entire tradition of ancient myth. From the sea, 2 enormous serpents appeared. They rose from the waves and moved with terrifying speed across the sand, their great heads lifted, their scales gleaming with salt water. In Virgil's famous version, they came straight for Laocoon. They coiled around his 2 young sons first, crushing them, and then they wrapped themselves around the priest himself. Laocoon struggled and cried out, a terrible sound, like a bull at the altar, and then he was still. The serpents slid away toward Athena's temple and disappeared beneath the goddess's shield, and Laocoon lay dead with his sons beside him. To modern eyes, the meaning seems obvious. A man who was right was killed for being right, and the warning was silenced. But the Trojans read it differently, and here lies one of the great psychological insights of this ancient story. To them, Laocoon's death was not a punishment for speaking the truth. It was a punishment for dishonoring a sacred offering. The gods, they believed, had struck him down because he had thrown his spear at the holy horse and angered divine Athena. The sign that should have saved them condemned them instead. This is the terrible mechanics of self-deception. The Trojans did not ignore the sign of the serpents. They interpreted it. They took a genuine, terrifying event and ran it through the filter of what they wanted to believe. And what came out the other side confirmed their wishes rather than challenged them. This is not stupidity. It is human nature. It is something every generation does, in every culture, in every age. We see signs in the world, and we read them the way we hope they read. Chapter 7. The Horse Within the Walls. The decision was made. The horse would be brought inside the city. Troy would take the gift, but the great gates of Troy, those massive ancient doors that had held against 10 years of assault, were not wide enough. And so the Trojans did what the Greeks had hoped they would do. They tore open a section of their own wall, the very walls that had protected them for a decade. They breached their own defenses with their own hands to welcome in the instrument of their destruction. The horse was placed on wheels and rollers, and teams of men, Trojan hands, hauled it through the gap in the wall, through the streets of the city, and up toward the sacred citadel. Children ran alongside it, laughing and reaching up to touch the wooden legs. Women watched from doorways. Old men looked on with expressions that mixed relief and something older and harder to name. An instinct, perhaps, that something was wrong, not strong enough to become a word, not weak enough to be fully ignored. Inside the horse, the Greek soldiers felt every bump, every lurch, every turn. They heard the creak of the rollers, the shouts of the men guiding the ropes, the sound of a city around them. They were inside the walls of Troy. After 10 years, they were inside. Homer tells us that Helen walked around the horse that night, calling out the names of Greek leaders while perfectly imitating the voices of their wives. One warrior, Anticlus, nearly answered, but Odysseus clamped his hand over the man's mouth and held the others absolutely still. That night, Troy celebrated as it had not celebrated in 10 years. There was feasting and singing in the streets. Wine flowed freely, too freely. The relief of the siege's end, the joy of survival, the belief that the gods had protected them, all of it combined into a wave of relief and celebration. A release of tension so powerful that caution and watchfulness simply dissolved in it. The city let itself feel safe for the first time in a decade. And so Troy slept. The streets fell quiet, the fires burned low. The guards at the walls, drunk and exhausted with relief, dozed at their posts. The city lay still under a dark sky, breathing the slow, deep breath of a people who believed they were safe. Out on the dark sea, around the headland at Tenedos, the Greek fleet had seen the signal fire, lit by Sinon on the appointed hour. The ships began to move, silently, oars dipping in dark water, carrying 1,000 ships back toward the shore. Chapter 8. Fire and Shadow. In the deep belly of the horse, in total darkness, Odysseus gave the signal. One by one, with agonizing care, the Greek soldiers pressed open the trapdoor and lowered themselves on a rope down to the cobblestones of Troy's sleeping streets. They landed in silence. They drew their weapons without a sound. Their sandals were muffled, their armor wrapped against clinking. For a few moments they stood still in the dark city, breathing the air of the place they had spent 10 years trying to reach. Then they moved. Some went to the gates of the city and opened them from the inside, the great gates swinging wide in the darkness to admit the rest of the Greek army, now landed on the beach and advancing rapidly across the plain. Others moved through the sleeping streets toward the citadel and the palace. The plan was precise and ruthless, born from 10 years of waiting and sharpened to a single purpose. Troy never saw it coming. Troy was dreaming of peace. The first screams rang out in the deepest hours of the night, not far from the walls where the first sentries were cut down before they could raise an alarm. But by then it was already too late. The Greeks were inside, the gates were open, the army was pouring through. Fire was being set to buildings at the city's edges, and the light of it painted the sky above Troy in shades of orange and gold, colors that looked from a distance almost beautiful before you understood what they meant. Troy woke to its own destruction. People stumbled from their houses into streets full of armed men and running shadows and the growing roar of fire. Mothers grabbed their children. Old men reached for weapons they had not lifted in years. Soldiers, half-dressed in armor, ran toward the sound of fighting without knowing where to go. The city, which had been so orderly, so civilized, so magnificent in its 10-year resistance, came apart in a single night with terrifying speed. The palace of Priam was among the last to fall. The old king, who had ruled Troy for decades, who had watched his sons die one by one, who had made the extraordinary journey to the Greek camp to beg Achilles for the body of his son Hector, dressed himself in armor he was too frail to fight in. He stood at the altar of Zeus in the palace courtyard. He would not flee, he would not hide, he would die as a king. Chapter 9. The Fate of Troy's People. The ancient accounts do not look away from what happened next, and neither should we. The fall of Troy was not a clean or glorious thing. Cities that fall in the night do not fall cleanly. Priam was killed at the altar where he sought sanctuary. His queen, Hecuba, who had given Troy so many of its finest sons and daughters, was taken as a slave. Her grief was so immense, so beyond ordinary human endurance, that the ancient poets could find no adequate language for it. Andromache, wife of the great Hector, who had already buried her husband, now lost her son, the young Astyanax, whom the Greeks killed because they feared he might one day grow into his father's strength and seek revenge. She was taken as a prize of war, as were many Trojan women, carried away from the burning city to live as slaves in distant lands. These are the stories that the ancient poets told with the most anguish. The warriors died with swords in their hands. The innocent suffered without the power to resist. But Troy's story did not end entirely that night. From the burning city, a small group escaped. Led by a prince named Aeneas, the son of the goddess Aphrodite and the mortal Anchises, this band of survivors carried with them the sacred objects of their civilization, the household gods of Troy, the memory of who they had been. Aeneas carried his elderly father on his back through the burning streets, holding his young son's hand, and led his people down to the shore and into the unknown. Virgil, writing roughly 7 centuries after Homer, would follow Aeneas across the Mediterranean, through storms and heartbreak and the underworld itself, to a new land in the west, Italy, and from Aeneas's descendants, according to that great tradition, would come Romulus and Remus, and from them the city of Rome. Troy fell, and Rome rose from its ashes. One of the most powerful empires the ancient world would ever know carried in its deepest foundation the memory of a city that burned in a single night because of a wooden horse. History is strange and beautiful and terrible. By morning, Troy was fire and silence. The towers that had stood for generations were down. The walls that Apollo and Poseidon had built with divine hands lay broken. The streets where children had played and merchants had traded and elders had gathered were filled with ash. The Greek ships, loaded with their spoils and their captives, began the long journey home, and many of those journeys would themselves become tragedies, because victory did not protect the Greeks from the anger of the gods. Agamemnon would be murdered by his own wife. Odysseus would wander for 10 more years before seeing Ithaca again. Victory in this story tastes of ash. It always has. This is one of the things that makes the Trojan War so enduring, so honest, so profoundly human. It does not let either side be simply the hero or simply the villain. Troy was beautiful and courageous, but it fell when exhaustion and hope overcame caution. Greece was clever and persistent, and won through deception, and paid its own terrible price. There are no clean hands in this story. There never are in the stories that last. Closing reflection, the echo of Troy. 3,000 years have passed since the poets first sang this story. We may never know how much history lies beneath the legend, but the story endures because it speaks to something deeper than historical certainty. The Trojan horse is not just a military tactic, it is a mirror. It reflects patterns of thought and feeling that repeat across centuries and individual lives. It shows us how we think, how we choose, and how we fail to listen when the truth is uncomfortable and the lie is beautiful. Think of the Trojans themselves, not as fools, but as exhausted, hopeful people who had survived a decade of war and desperately wanted it to be over. Their mistake was not ignorance, it was desire. They wanted the horse to be a gift. They wanted the gods to be on their side. They wanted the morning on that empty beach to be the beginning of peace. And that wanting, that beautiful, utterly human wanting, undid everything. The phrase Trojan horse has entered many languages around the world. We use it for malicious computer programs that disguise themselves as harmless software. We use it for political strategies that hide real intentions behind acceptable appearances. We use it whenever something dangerous disguises itself as something welcome. The metaphor is 3,000 years old, and it is still accurate today. That is the measure of a truly great story. And perhaps the deepest lesson is this. The walls of Troy did not fall from the outside. They fell because the Trojans dismantled their own wall to bring in what destroyed them. The greatest threats do not always come as armies at the gate. Sometimes they come as gifts. Sometimes they come wearing the face of what you most want. Sometimes they come because we hold the door open ourselves, with our own hands, wearing our most hopeful smiles. This is what the ancient poets understood. This is what they have been trying to tell us ever since. Thank you for listening to English Through Great Stories. If this episode moved you, challenged you, or simply gave you something beautiful to think about, please share it with someone who loves language and history as much as you do. We will return with more stories from the ancient world, stories that are old enough to be called myth and true enough to feel like memory. Until then, read widely, listen carefully, and beware always of beautiful gifts left on empty shores. Troy burned in a single night, but the story of Troy, the warning it carries, the grief it holds, the questions it refuses to stop asking, has never gone out.